Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Radcliffe Fellowship Program at Harvard University. Today we are speaking with Asifa Majid. Asifa is this year's William Bentinck-Smith Fellow and a Professor of Cognitive Science at Oxford University, specializing in the study of language, culture, and mind. She has spent more than 2 decades using innovative research to challenge core but understudied tenets of language and cognition. The strength of Asifa's work lies in the broad base of her sources, both disciplinary and cultural. She combines laboratory and field experiments, in-depth linguistic studies, and descriptions informed by ethnography. In addition, Asifa focuses her analysis on underdescribed languages of small-scale indigenous communities. This is especially timely research as UNESCO declared this the International Decade of Indigenous Language in order to preserve and promote linguistic diversity in sustainable development. Through her work, Asifa charts the differences and commonalities of the human experience, often but not always expressed through language. She has spoken of the necessity of diverse perspective in developing theories of human language and cognition. Over the last decades, Asifa has studied olfactory vocabularies, the various languages used to describe smells. She has overturned centuries' worth of claims on the subject with her empirical studies. Other concepts she has studied include the body, action, space, and how concepts developed over a child's lifetime. While at Radcliffe, she is synthesizing lessons from her decades of empirical work in a book. Her focus is on the basic building blocks of conceptual meaning across languages. Asifa is developing a theory of conceptual variation and change that integrates insight across disciplines and from multiple languages. For many, Asifa's name is a challenge to pronounce. None of the I's in her name are pronounced, as you might suppose. The I in her first name is silent, Asifa, and the I in her last name is E, Majid. It is a great pleasure to welcome Asifa Majid to the podium.
Thank you, Claudia. Thanks, everyone here, my fellow fellows. It's customary to begin by a thank you rather than to end with thanks. And I just wanted to say that after 2 years of interacting with people remotely through pandemic lockdowns, it has been such an inspiration being with all of you to rediscover poetry and art and music and be confronted with social justice issues and learn about history and robotic fish. And thank you, everyone. And thanks especially to the Radcliffe staff who are incredible. And I can't thank the Ways enough. So just know it's deeply, deeply felt. And thank you, everyone, for joining online today. But mostly my talk is for my fellows. We talk a lot kind of in the background about what we do. But here, I just wanted to share some of my excitement about investigating language and thought. So language is this strange thing where it's both the thing with which we think, but also the thing with which we communicate. And these different pressures lead it to have distinct properties, and I hope to share some of that with you today. Now, when you're thinking about the relationship between language and thought, you're immediately mired in controversy. On the one hand, people think language and thought are innate and universal. So this is perhaps best typified by Noam Chomsky, who says, language and thought are awakened in the mind and follow a largely predetermined course. It grows in the mind on the basis of our biological nature, triggered by appropriate experience and in a limited way shaped by experience. We can contrast that with others who think that language and thought are learned and relative. So for example, Nick Evans and Steve Levinson have claimed languages differ so fundamentally from one another at every level of description, sound, grammar, lexicon, meaning, that it's very hard to find any single structural property that they share. So we have these contrasting views. My own research has led me to a different conclusion about this. There is certainly evidence that there's some pre-linguistic precursors to thinking, but also substantive evidence of relativity in the adult state. So what kind of thing can we see? How can we establish whether something's innate? Well, one thing that we can do is look at what babies can do. And by using eye tracking with 9-month-old babies who haven't yet learned the color words of their language, we can show that they already possess categories of blue, green, and purple. We can also look at how they associate the senses together. So here are a couple of videos that we've used with babies. So we show videos where sounds are changing as a ball changes a spatial location. And I think when you watch these, you'll feel that one of these is more intuitive or right than the other. So I'll play the first one. And now the second. So we can show these videos on a loop to a baby, which I'll show you here. So this baby sitting on a chair, the mother's behind wearing headphones so she can't inadvertently cue the baby. And in the corner, you'll be able to see a mirror, here, which shows what the baby can see in the screen in front of it. And you can see the baby's really excited right now. Something's finally happening. There's a star moving around. And that's just so that we can see where the baby's looking to make sure that we're tracking the eyes correctly. Once we're sure that the baby's now looking in the center of the screen, we'll start a trial. And we'll just play the video on this loop while the sound's going and see how long they look. And what we can show is that babies already at 4 months prefer to watch a video for longer when the tone is rising as the ball rises in space. They already have a sense of which sounds go with which spatial locations. So that's some of the kind of evidence this shows is that there are some innate precursors or building blocks for concepts. For relativity, it's kind of tricky, actually. So one of the things that I wanted to share with you was the state of my field. If you look at the languages of the world, here plotted over geographic space according to linguistic diversity. So the larger the area, the more languages that are spoken in that part of the world. So you can see Europe is relatively small, Africa is relatively large, Papua New Guinea is huge. If against that, I plot where we have data from psychology experiments, so around 15 years ago, Arnick looked at the major American psychology journals to see who are the participants of these studies. We can see that 68% of them come from the US, 14% from the UK, another 13% from the rest of Europe, 3% from Asia, mostly China and Japan, 1% from South America, 1% from the Middle East, mostly Israel, and 0.2% from Africa. That is not representative of the diversity that we see worldwide. Now, this paper caused a big furore in the field, and yet, when we look again a decade later, hardly anything shifted at all. The reason that we should care about this is that people that are being sampled are demographically weird, and that's a term that Joe Henrich at Harvard and his colleagues have termed. They're primarily Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic participants, and these people are outliers on a bunch of cognitive tasks. So if you look at perception to social cognition, these people behave in very different ways compared to the rest of the global diversity. Not only are they weird, I think it's a problem that we've been over-focusing on English as a language of both test and the tool that we use in order to do our scientific investigations. English is only one of 7,000 languages that are spoken in the world today. Sadly, right now, one language goes extinct every 3 months, and the rate of extinction is accelerating. 50% of languages will be extinct or seriously endangered by the end of this century, and 40% of the languages that are currently exist are completely undescribed. So we don't even know what is possible in the world's languages because we have still under-investigated what there is in the world. And it's crazy when you think about it, even in our understanding of child language acquisitions, you think you study language and you want to understand how children acquire it. Even there, most of our information is coming from English. So this is a graph just of Indo-European languages, and you can see that studies of English way outstrip any other language. And that's a problem because just as weird people are outliers, English seems to be an outlier in many different phenomena. So if we look at grammaticalized categories, morphology, phonology, syntax, English really seems to be quite different from many other languages. Now, from my point of view, each language encapsulates a system of knowledge within a specific cultural context. And so going beyond English, both as an object of inquiry as well as a tool for investigation, is necessary to decolonize the mind, and I mean that in multiple ways. So importantly, just to illustrate some of this diversity, English has around 40 phonemes, or unique sounds, if you like. And yet, if we look at the world's languages, we see that Rotokas has only 11, whereas languages like Sho, and I'm going to not be able to pronounce the tones here, have more than 100 phonemes. Now, not all languages, of course, are in the auditory modality. We find sign languages across the world, and there's hundreds of different sign languages, each completely independent of the other. So humans are unique in having this need for communication that transcends any one modality. We find a way to communicate systematically in whatever channel is available to us. In English, if I want to make a declarative statement involving two participants, then I put the subject at the beginning of the sentence, followed by the verb, then the object. So John cooked the rice. But if we look across the world's languages, we find that every possible way of organizing subjects, objects, and verbs exists. Still, you find that some are less frequent. So putting the object and the subject before the verb is only there in a handful of the world's languages. So we want to account for both what exists, the possibility space, and also why some things exist more frequently than others, because that tells us something about the property of mind. But really, most of my work is in the juicy stuff, which is meaning and how meaning is packaged. So if we look at concepts of ingestion, English makes a distinction between eating solid things, drinking liquids, and ingesting smoke with smoke. But if you're a Punjabi speaker, my other native language, then you make a distinction between eating solids and non-solid things, ka or pi. If you're a speaker of Jahai, there's no generic eat verb. You have to specify what kind of thing you're eating. You hew if it's a leafy thing, you gay if it's a starch, you much if it's meat, and you but if it's other fleshy, fruity things. Even when it comes to thinking about the body, we find variation. So Dutch, like English, makes a distinction between hands and arms. And if I ask people to color in the hand and the arm, you can find this distinction. So Dutch speakers are a bit unsure, is that hand a part of the arm or not part of the arm? But if we look at Japanese, we see actually here now people aren't sure whether the arm is part of the hand or not. And if you go to Indonesian, in fact, there's only one term for the hand-arm. So if we're looking across limbs, the upper arm, lower arm, hand, upper leg, lower leg, foot, across different languages, we can see that the way to segment this is quite different. Whether we're looking at everyday actions or body parts, large-scale space or small-scale space, notions of time or emotions or perception, variation is the norm. And that's why we have to really think about diversity as a core concern when we're thinking about language and mind. And for me, that's meant a commitment to doing field work. So in my work, I use a mixture of methods, as Claudia alluded to. We do in my lab ethnographic observation, targeted linguistic elicitation. We do field experiments, but we also try to take experiments into larger scale contexts and weird contexts to museums. It doesn't replace lab experiments because you can control things in a way and do things that you would never get away with in the real world. But we look at how language is used in everyday conversation and in online text. Fieldwork for me is important because you want to go where language lives to improve the ecological validity of our findings. You want to facilitate inclusive cross-linguistic comparison, and it helps examine the nexus of culture, language, structure, and daily discourse practice. And it helps illuminate the meanings of forms as they're situated in context and sequence. At the same time, we want to use experiments because we can target domains where the corpora are silent. You can wait forever to try and observe some phenomena, it'll just never occur. So to conduct focused cross-linguistic comparison experiments are important. And it helps us examine the nexus of language and cognition and giving us insight into linguistic processing. And it helps illuminate the referential meaning and uncover lexical structure. And I'll explain some of these as we go along. What I wanted to do for the rest of the talk is focus on perception and show for the most simple sensory experiences, even here we find that culture and language is shaping our sensory worlds. So in Western scholarship, it's long been proposed that there's a hierarchy of the senses, that vision is the most important sense for humans, followed by audition, and that touch, taste, and smell play little role in our mentation. So this view sometimes is associated with Aristotle. It's called the Aristotelian hierarchy. It's a little bit unfair, because actually Aristotle had smell in the middle. So for hearing and sight, you can see things at a distance, but touch and taste require contact with the object. And so for Aristotle, smell was in the middle because it had this kind of labile role. You can smell something from across the room. But today, smell is always at the bottom of the hierarchy, and it's because it's considered not to play an important role in human life. So, for example, Steve Pinker claims that smell is vestigial in humans and how the mind works. Howard Gardner, who's thought about multiple intelligences, says when it comes to keen gustatory or olfactory senses, these abilities have little special value across cultures. And Diane Ackerman claims that smell is the mute sense, the one without words. These are just some illustrative quotes. I could have given you dozens more that all go along with this idea that there's a hierarchy of the senses. So we can ask whether this hierarchy is present in language as well. And to do that, we conducted a large-scale study of the senses using a standardized protocol. So we created sensory stimuli that had colors that were sampled from across color space, shapes that were good and poor gestalt forms, sounds that varied in pitch, loudness, and tempo, tactile textures of various kinds, so people wore luxurious blindfolds and then felt things to describe them, tastes, sweet, sour, salty, bitter, umami, and smell. So these are micro-encapsulated odors or scratch and sniff smells that you can scratch and smell. So the task is always very simple. You see one sensory stimulus at a time, and you just have to name it. That's it. But we do this in 20 different languages across the world. We try to sample the languages to be as diverse as possible. So they are some large languages like English, which was collected in Austin, Texas, but also languages like Cantonese or Lao, which are spoken by millions of speakers, but many small-scale societies as well. So Umpala here in Cape York was, at the time of data collection, spoken only by a dozen or so speakers. We also have 3 sign languages. So we have American Sign Language that I introduced you to earlier, British Sign Language, which is completely unrelated, and neither of them are related to English. And then Katakalok, which is a village sign that's around 3 to 4 generations old that emerged in Bali. So we can look at both the modality of the language to see how that influences how people talk about the senses, as well as looking at languages in very different cultural contexts, small-scale communities, farming communities, large industrialized communities. And of course, one single person can't do this, so this is a collaborative effort. So I work with people who are committed to long-lasting or long-scale descriptive work in communities around the world. So they're either doing field work or they're native speakers themselves with expertise in these languages. So just to emphasize the data collection, this is Claire Hill, who collected data from an Ompala speaker, giving one sensory stimulus at a time, a color, a shape, a smell, and just asking people to name them. The data is audio and video recorded and then later transcribed according to a standardized format. And then what we're looking for is the main descriptive response for each stimulus. And what we're going to measure is there agreement in how people talk about this? So we don't know what the correct answer is and how to describe these senses in each language. We're just going to say if something is highly codable, is highly consistent within a speaker community, that means that's something that's talked about frequently, that's something that's important in that culture. So we can ask whether there's a hierarchy of the senses. Here, the scale is the other way around. Now, vision is plotted over here, sound, touch, taste, and smell. What I'm going to do is I'm going to plot the average agreement score for each language. So if everybody completely agreed on how to describe every single stimulus, then you'd get a score of 1. If for a stimulus, every single person gave a different response, you'd get a score of 0. And if there's some level of agreement in between, we'll get a score in between. We don't care about the absolute numbers. What I care about is the rank order of the senses. Is it the case that vision is always the most consistent, followed by sound, touch, taste, and smell? If we look at English, it turns out that it fits a predicted hierarchy better than chance, so we can model this statistically. But it's the only language out of the 20 that does that. Out of the 20 languages that we tested, there's 13 different rank orders of the senses. So if we can compare English with Ompala, we find that smell is the most codable and shape is the least codable. If we look at Farsi, we see taste is highly codable. We can talk about that later, whereas if we go to Doggledom, then we see that touch is the most codable. There's rampant variation across each of our languages. Now, that leads to the question, can we account for this cross-linguistic variation through cultural parameters? Is it just random, every language does its own thing, or is it systematic and related to cultural practices? So to look at that, we can think about both macro-level cultural properties and micro-level cultural properties. So here, macro level, I'm using for things like population size. So we know that not all languages are spoken by the same number of speakers. Some languages are big, like English. Others are spoken by only a few hundred or thousand people. So we can ask, does it matter the size of your population? Does it matter if in your society there's formal schooling and literacy? Maybe that's important for something like shape. Or maybe it's important just to get standardization. We can also look at specific micro features. So for each domain, we can look at the ethnographic record and say what's been suggested to be an important factor here. So for example, it's been suggested that color naming might be related to color technology. The idea is that in their natural state, if I want to distinguish this banana from this one, I don't have to refer to color. I can just talk about ripe and unripe bananas. But once we get to applying colors to things, maybe using ripe and unripe doesn't have the same import. So here it probably would refer to the smell rather than the color of the t-shirt. So now when you're applying colors to different sorts of things, to walls, to my face, to clothes, then you need color vocabulary. And similarly, there's been suggestions that perhaps traditional crafts might be related to naming shapes, or that sound naming might be related to specialist musicians, or that cuisine might be related to food naming, and so forth. So to examine this more closely, we constructed an ethnographic questionnaire where we target each of these properties in each of the 20 cultures that we've studied. And we try to see if we can predict the linguistic data that we got separately. And in fact, we can predict a number of things. So just to go over a few of these, we find that regardless of the specific modality that we're looking at, overall, the larger the population, the more agreement there is in how people name things. So this was surprising to me. I would have thought in small-scale communities there would be more agreement. And in larger scale communities where you get more differentiation and stratification, you might start getting more disagreement. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And potentially the reason for that is that the small scale societies, you have more shared context that you can rely on, shared knowledge that you can rely on. And so you don't need to have systematization in the same way that you do for large scale societies. We also find that having formal schooling also increases agreement in how you name things across the board. Specifically, we find that having specialist musicians in a culture means that everybody is agreeing on how to name abstract things about music, like pitch and loudness. Having formal schooling also specifically predicts the way that people talk about shapes, but so does having patterned pottery in your culture. And if you live in houses that are angular, you're better at naming angular shapes than if you live in circular housing. And we find that hunter-gatherers show more agreement in how they name smells than non-hunter-gatherers, and I'm going to come back to that a bit later. What we didn't find, though, was that color naming was related to color technology, and this was quite surprising. So there's been a long-standing idea that technology should be color, dyeing technology in particular, should be important for color naming. So Anna Wierzbicka has claimed that discriminating between abstract colors is a mental habit which makes sense in a world full of manufactured objects. Paul Kay and Maffei claimed it's rare that naturally occurring objects or the artifacts of technologically simple societies are distinguishable only by color. And Ted Gibson and colleagues claimed that an extensive botanical vocabulary, as found in hunter-gatherer communities, for example, might mean that you don't need color terms. And so this was kind of puzzling and led us to investigate in more detail a hunter-gatherer community in Thailand, the Innate. So this is a small language group of only around 300 people where people are still living a nomadic hunter-gatherer lifestyle today. And this work was done with my former student and now collaborator, Evelina Bentinck, who's been doing long-term fieldwork with this community for a number of years. What we showed using a number of different methods, including just a color naming paradigm of the kind that I showed you before, was that the Innate, in fact, have a large systematic color lexicon, much larger than has been predicted based on previous work. And if we look at the full record of languages that we know something about now, when we start coding languages that are hunter-gatherer in red and comparing them to non-hunter-gatherer communities, we see that hunter-gatherer communities can have large color lexicons and show high agreement in how they talk about colors. So contrary to the claim that an extensive botanical vocabulary might mean that you don't need color terms, actually, it kind of doesn't make sense. The prediction doesn't fall in the right way. So if we look at different types of cultures, we find that small-scale cultivators have an average 3 times larger vocabulary for plants and animals than hunter-gatherers do. So that would predict that small-scale farmers actually should have more problems in naming colors than hunter-gatherers, which is not what we find. And contrary to the claim that naturally occurring objects don't need color naming, and that it's not common to find that, if you look at biological variation in situ, you find that there are many species that are distinguished only by color. So for the Innate, there's various kinds of tubers that are distinguished by color. There's different types of animals that are distinguished by color. And in fact, if you look at everyday discourse, you can see that people are using color terms first to attract attention, for example, saying, look, red thing, and then identifying what the object is later. So if you think about tropical rainforest, what's catching your eye first as a way of focusing joint attention, and then later getting into detail. So the Innate show that a society with simple material technology, including dyeing technology, can nevertheless have a large color lexicon and high color naming efficiency. And then we need the data before we can start making these sorts of speculations about what is or isn't possible in language. I want to jump now to sound and just look at the kinds of descriptions that we get for sounds across languages. So when we're talking about variation in pitch, in English, we use the metaphor high pitch, low pitch. But if we look at the 20 languages in our sample, the high pitch and low pitch has been said to be something that's fundamental about our perceptual experience. So in one study by Parise and colleagues, they wired people up in Bielefeld to directional microphones. So they just wore these directional microphones for a week. And the researchers measured the auditory acoustics of everything that they heard over that week. And what they found was that higher pitched sounds, in fact, come from higher in space than lower in space. And even more, they claim that the convolutions of the ear, they're anatomically perfect to exactly get this pitch variation in the natural environment. So it seems that our ears have evolved to detect the kind of auditory pitch that is found in Bielefeld, at least. So that suggests this high-low metaphor in language might reflect something about our perceptual experience. High sounds really do come from high in space. But if we look at the 20 languages in our sample, we found that the most frequent metaphor for talking about pitch wasn't high-low. It was small, big, and thin, thick instead. And you can see, actually, that all of these metaphors might have their sources in experience. So if we look at the size of animals and the calls that they produce, we see that there's a correlation. So, for example, small birds sound like this, and elephants sound like this. So there seems to be a correlation. Now, there is a little caveat. Here's a koala, and this is what it sounds like. Not what you might have been expecting. But nevertheless, there's generally a correlation between the size of the animal and the sound that it produces. Similarly, we find in musical instruments a correlation between thickness and pitch. So I don't think it will be any surprise to find that this sound comes from a thicker string than this one. So it seems that there could be perceptual bases for all of these different metaphors that appear in language. But I wanted to know whether these different ways of talking about sounds might influence how people of different communities actually think about the sounds themselves. And so with my former student Sarah Dolscheid and other colleagues, we looked at this in an experimental setting. So the experiment's really simple. People see lines on the screen in different locations while they hear a sound. And then they just have to sing back that sound when they get a prompt. So we play sounds of different frequencies, and people just sing them back. So if you ask people to do that, they say, "Oh, don't make me do it. I'm a really bad singer." You say, "No, do it anyway." And if you look at the sounds that we play people and the sounds that they reproduce, then there's a very strong correlation between them, so 0.99. So they might not be absolute pitch, but they're able to produce a relative pitch differences. But what we really are interested in is what happens when we play these sounds while there's lines at different locations on the screen, so different heights, or at different thicknesses. So we take a number of different heights and thicknesses, and we cross them with the different sounds of different frequencies, and we look to see what effect there is of having an irrelevant spatial stimulus when you're reproducing a sound. And what do we find? Here we tested Dutch participants who, like English, have a high-low metaphor. When Dutch participants have to sing a note back, when they see a high line, they sing that note back higher than when they see a line that's low on the screen. But for Farsi speakers who have a thin, thick metaphor in their language, that makes no difference. But for Farsi speakers, when we play the same note in the face of a thin line, they sing it back higher than when they see a thick line. But for the Dutch speakers, this makes no difference. So the way that people are hearing and reproducing sounds is influenced by their native metaphor, even when they're not using that metaphor. And in fact, the metaphor is completely useless for you. There's lines are in all different, there's too many different lines and sounds for it to be helpful to be labeling them in the moment. Finally, I want to take the last moments to talk about smell, which is something that I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about over the last decade or so. And just to remind you, the idea has been, the consensus has been that smell is something that's not a value across cultures and that's something that can't be put into words. And this is something that I've been investigating with direct fieldwork myself with the Jahai, who are related to the Innate I showed you earlier. The Jahai are also a hunter-gatherer community of around 1,000 speakers who hunter-gatherer community of around 1,000 speakers who are still living a mostly traditional lifestyle, although some people are settling now. And the world expert of this language is Nicholas Bernholt, who's written a grammar of this language. And the work that I've done is in collaboration with him. He really knows everything about this language. And together, we were able to show that the Jahai, in fact, have around 12 words to describe different qualities of smell. So these are words that are specific to smell. They can't be used for taste. They can't be used for color. They can't be used for anything else. They're verbs, so they're not nouns. They don't refer to specific objects. In fact, they don't seem to be related to any of the object vocabulary that we've looked at. And they are used to capture smell qualities that go beyond things that are easily translatable into English, but to give you a flavor or scent of what that might be like. I have a few slides. So the term hayet, for example, is used for the smell of shrimp paste, tiger, tree sap. That's different from the smell bu'us, which is for some species of hornbill and mushroom, but also cooked rice, cooked cabbage. That's different from latbut smells, which are for fragrant flowers, soap, durian, but also this bear cat that smells like popcorn some of the time. Ba'i is for bloody sorts of smells, but also fresh meat, some species of toad and fish and otter. Junges is a term used for smoky smells, but also some species of wild ginger, centipede, and bat droppings, bat caves, or stinging sort of smell, perhaps. So these terms are picking out smell qualities. And when we test Jahai speakers experimentally and compare them to another Western group here, Dutch participants, then we can show that the Jahai really behave in a very different way to smells than your average Western speaker. So in one study, we took monomolecular odorants sampled from across odor space, so just single molecules that neither the Jahai nor the Dutch will have experienced in their natural environment in that way, so we can control exactly what we're giving people. And what we do is we take the odorant and we put them into marker pens. So the pens that you can write on a whiteboard with, but instead of being filled with ink, they're filled with different smells. And what we do is we just give the speakers the different odorants and ask them to name them. So here's a Jahai speaker, and I'm presenting him with a smell to name. Oh, excuse me a second. Here we go.
Number 2.
Okay, this is the same odor now with the Dutch participant.
Number 3.
So you can immediately see there's something qualitatively different happening with the Jahai and the Dutch participant. And in case you're curious, this is an odorant that we gave to people, and it's meant to have a buttery, milky sorts of smell, which the Jahai participant described as bu'us, which is makes sense when you consider these are people that don't eat dairy. They're living in tropical rainforest, eating only game around them. If we look at overall at all the odors that we gave people, around 50 odors, in 30 different people, we see that overwhelmingly Jahai participants always use one of their 12 dedicated smell terms to describe the different smell qualities, whereas Dutch people try to describe the sources, like cinnamon, or maybe they describe a scenario, it's like my grandmother's house, or maybe that it's good, or maybe using a cross-modal metaphor, like it smells a bit green. But not only do they differ in their linguistic strategies, they differ in their timing, as I just showed you in those videos. So on average, if we look across participants on the x-axis here, 30 Jahai participants and 30 Dutch participants, and look at the time that it takes for people to name the odors, we see on average Jahai take 2 seconds to name a smell, and Dutch participants take 13 seconds. And that's to say, I don't know. If you measure until they give a meaningful, contentful response, it's about half a minute. Now the advantage of recording participants while they're doing the study is that we can also look at their facial expressions to odors. So we can measure the facial movements to ask whether Jahai and Dutch participants experience the odors in different ways. So do they have different emotional reactions to the odors, and that's why they name them in different ways? Or is it that they share an emotional reaction but only differ in the naming? So the first couple of videos I showed you were just taken at random, but these have been selected to illustrate a specific point. So this is the same Jahai participant now naming a different odor. So you can see there's a lot happening in that video. If we're measuring facial movements, we have to be thoughtful about what we're measuring. So first of all, there's a strong disgust response. Then he laughs, but the laugh isn't because the smell is good. He's laughing about this social situation, like, I can't believe you made me smell something that's so disgusting, something like that. So what we do is we're only looking at the facial expressions that are elicited from when the pen is closest to the nose, that start within a few hundred milliseconds. Anything that happens later, we don't code. And this is a term that he used, Bentinck. The actual odor is in fact something that's oily or rancid or sweaty. This is a Dutch participant with the same odor. Okay, so we look at the muscle movements of the faces, we can see that there's a strong correlation in which smells elicit a disgust response and which ones elicit a more pleasant response. So what that suggests is that there's an initial universal emotional reaction to odors and then later culture-specific packaging for language. And more broadly, I think what it tells us that we really need to go beyond our weird participants to think about diversity more seriously, because we find that smell is something that's culturally important and something that can be put into words. And usually about this time, people say, well, what about experts in the West? Aren't they good? So Robert Parker, for example, has developed a full dictionary to describe wines: angular, austere, backward, chewy, decadent, dumb, precocious, unctuous. But some people are skeptical. So Quant claims the wine trade is intrinsically bullshit prone and therefore attracts bullshit artists. Even wine experts themselves have some thoughts about this. They say, Malcolm Gluck used to write for The Guardian in the UK. He says, we wine writers are the worst qualified of critical experts. This is largely, though not exclusively, because we are the most poorly equipped. The most important tool at our disposal is inadequate for the job. That tool is the English language. So we have different points of view here. In my work, we've shown using both corpus studies and experimental methods that wine experts do differ from lay people in how they name wines. They do show more agreement. There is systematicity, and that seems to affect the way that they remember and imagine wines as well. So perhaps the criticism, the skepticism isn't completely warranted. So I think even within Western contexts, if we just go outside of our undergraduate samples and think about the different ways of life and experiences that people have, that would be a first step to thinking about what is possible in human language and cognition. So to wrap up, Theories of language and thought must take human diversity seriously, and I hope I've illustrated that for you today. The mapping of language onto the senses is something that's culturally relative, and I showed, at least in one example, that across cultures, language shapes our mental life too. Thank you.
This was so fascinating. I mean, I have a million questions, but I'll stick to the questions that we have here, and feel free to ask more. We have a little bit of time. I've read that scent is the strongest sense tied to memory. But would a better way to think of this, that the scent tied to cultural understanding? I'm not sure I understand what So, but would a better way to think of this is that a sense is tied to cultural understanding? Okay, cultural understanding and memory. What's the relationship?
So I think the thing that comes to mind often for people when it comes to smell and memory is the Proustian moment, which is actually involves taste. So the character eats a madeleine and then has this flashback moment to the grandmother. But generally people have thought that specific smells can trigger very strong autobiographical memories, and maybe that's the reason that we don't have a language for smells, because language involves abstraction. You have to get away from a specific episode to think about something that goes across different contexts. I'm skeptical as that being the reason why we don't have smell language, because for all of our senses, there's always this tension between remembering the specific episode and thinking about the general kind of thing that there is. And of course, we have sensory memories for all of our senses too, so both can happen. Definitely, culture matters for our sense of smell, but I would say it matters for all of our senses.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. In your studies, have you considered cultural diversity within the same countries, I guess in relation to language, of course?
Small excursions into this. So depending on how you think about it, we could think of wine experts as being a subculture with particular kinds of knowledge and expertise. And so I've certainly gone in that direction. I think there's a lot more to do. So one thing I've been thinking about recently is just world Englishes. So here we think about English as a monolithic phenomena, but we know that Nigerian English and Indian English may have distinct properties. If they don't linguistically differ, but the cultural contexts are different, that makes for a very nice experimental situation, the kind of thing psychologists always want. So here you have the same language, but perhaps different cultural practices. Mm-hmm. So we could try and look to see whether certain mental activities go with culture or with language coding. So I think that could be an interesting way to go. But even within the US, there's certainly a lot more diversity than is sadly the norm within psychological investigation. And there's, I think, important movements to try and change that, but it seems to be happening very slowly.
Right. Have you tested people who speak more than one language? Do multilingual speakers develop different responses to the smell, for example?
I think we haven't looked at this systematically in bilinguals, but that's definitely a very exciting way to go. Mm-hmm. So it seems that learning different languages opens up more conceptual possibilities than being completely monolingual. So when you're monolingual, I think it's very easy to believe that language directly reflects some reality out there, that there really are blues and greens. When you speak multiple languages, you see that how you partition things and language differs, and so I think that opens up more possibility that things could be another way. But there's many exciting questions to ask about bilingual brains, exactly how and when these different languages come online, when you use them. lots of exciting possibilities there.
A fun area of research, I'm sure. Let's see. Is there a reason why the languages from India are underrepresented in such research, although there are plenty in number?
There's no theoretical reason that they're not there.
It's just that there are researchers.
I think it's, there is an asymmetry in the languages that we know about. So we know about large languages like English and Mandarin, and then there was a real effort to try and document small-scale languages where it seemed that there was the most different types of cultures and possibilities. And so that has meant that for many large languages that are kind of in the middle, they've been overlooked because there hasn't been the same, I think, impetus to try and document them. And generally, even researchers who speak those languages end up working on majority languages and cultures, which I think is also a gap that needs to be redressed.
Mm-hmm. We couldn't miss a question about the internet. So is there any research that quantifies the influence of internet on language evolution?
There are some cool things happening in sociolinguistics that track how new words emerge and how they spread over space. So some of them happening in the US, which shows, for example, that you find innovation of new terminology happening in urban areas and then spreading slowly kind of into the middle of the country. Mm-hmm. So there are some investigations like that. Other people have been excited about the possibility of using the internet to try and figure out cultural changes. So something that's also been called culturomics, to see certain keywords that seem to be high frequency at a certain moment and then fall away, and maybe that reflects something about a particular interest at the time. Yeah. So I think there's interesting ways of using it to track linguistic change and movement, but also as a tool to investigate language change.
Yeah. So you've touched on sign language, and there is a comment about, can you tell more about how sign language has performed in the test that you've done?
Yeah. So one naive hypothesis one might have is that perhaps all sign languages code the senses in the same way. Because of the modality, perhaps there are certain affordances that they have that spoken languages don't, or vice versa, but we don't find that. So the sign languages, in fact, pattern quite differently. So Kata Kalok, which was spoken in Bali, has a different hierarchy of the senses than American Sign Language, for example. So what seems to be relevant isn't necessarily the modality of the language, but the cultural practices that go along with the community that we're investigating.
Yeah. The next question follows what you said about the wine experts, and the question is, for smell, have you compared participants of certain professions, like such as chefs, with regular participants in the general population?
So the wine studies that I very briefly alluded to at the end, we looked at wine experts, coffee experts, and lay people. That was probably the best study to be a participant in. So to be a participant in that study, you had to drink at least 1 glass of wine a week, 1 coffee a week, but you shouldn't know anything about it. So we had a special separate questionnaire where we established whether you actually genuinely knew something about wines or coffees. So our wine experts were wine experts, but not coffee experts. Our coffee experts knew about coffee, but not wines. And so what we find there is that the specialization matters. So wine experts name smells and tastes of wine with more agreement, but it doesn't generalize to coffees and it doesn't generalize to everyday smells. So their enhanced noses are only specific to the thing that they've trained in.
Fascinating. Yeah. Okay, let's go back to the video of the baby that you showed at the beginning. We saw a baby matching pitch with high and low sounds. Later you show that different languages think differently about pitch. How to explain these terms of presumably preverbal baby's behavior? So how does that correlate?
That's a great question, and I think a challenge for us at the moment. So, when we look at, if we look at the baby before language and then the adult, there's clearly something very different happening. So, over the last few years, we've been looking at the development of cross-modal associations, like the link between sound and space. And what we find is that already around 3 years of age, the kids look quite different from one another. So the babies seem to have this potentiality there, but as soon as they're learning their language, they are in line with the adults in their community and start differing from one another. So there's some more complexity about that, but what it suggests is that in the same way that we are, as infants, open to learning any sound that there is in any language, the phoneme inventories differ across languages, but around 9 months, kids start distinguishing their own native language sounds from foreign ones, and they can tell the difference. And they're not as sensitive to foreign distinctions anymore. In the same way, it seems that we're open to certain kinds of conceptual relationships, but as we get into the grooves of our particular language, we're losing perhaps the ability to entertain alternatives as easily anymore.
Yeah. This is kind of a Radcliffe question. Did you find sensory perception differences between gender across different cultures? So, the gender question.
Yeah, we haven't looked at gender specifically. I think this is something that's likely to be conditioned by I guess there's an underlying question there is, are there biological gender differences, or to what extent are these sensory asymmetries driven by culture? So there are a number of studies of Western English-speaking participants that show, for example, better odor naming in women, also better color naming in women, basically better language in women. So generally, like, women seem to have larger vocabularies and they show more agreement and they make finer grained distinctions. That seems to be the case. So whether that doesn't seem to be a sensory issue necessarily, but a language issue.
Yeah.
But I think I don't have enough data on this, because to really establish gender differences, you have to test many, many people. But my anecdotal observation is that for the Jahai, it seems that the men do better in the odor naming tasks than the women. So they agree more with one another in how they're describing the smells than the women do.
Okay.
And if that's relevant for foraging, which typically the men are more likely to do, then maybe that explains that. But it's really just, this is just observation. I don't have systematic data to back that.
Right.
So it's something that is certainly open for further investigation.
Interpretation. And I wonder whether the data might not be available for the next question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Let's think about music. Does the same music spark the same reactions in different cultures, or is it too complex to analyze?
Yeah, this is hugely controversial at the moment. So there are some very cool studies that are happening looking at, for example, musical dissonance, whether that's something that's universally recognized, maybe not. I think, I guess if I was to show a bias, I would suggest that this is something that's also shaped by cultural experience. And there's some data that seems to support that, but it might depend on exactly what you're looking at. So in the same way that I showed, like, just for pleasant, unpleasant odors, there seems to be some universals. There may be some parameters of musical experience that are shared, and then others that are more open to cultural shaping.
Interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Asifa. This was brilliant. I want to thank our fellows here and our audience online. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe events. You can find more about them at radcliffe.harvard.edu, where you can also find video of past events. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great rest of the day. Thank you.